At midnight, Charleston does not become quiet, it becomes audible. The harbor keeps breathing against the seawall. Old floorboards answer footsteps from empty rooms, and beneath the polished streets, 4 centuries of fire, slavery, war, disease, and disaster remain hidden in the walls. Some of the stories are documented, some are legends. A few refuse to stay entirely on one side of that line. Tonight, we are going to uncover Charleston's hidden mysteries slowly, as a sleep story rather than a scare story. We will visit the Unitarian graveyard linked to Edgar Allan Poe and The Lady in White, the Old City Jail and the legend of Lavinia Fisher, the Dock Street Theater, the Battery, the Pirate House, Fort Sumter, the earthquake scars beneath the streets, the underground cisterns, the Gullah Coast, and the old plantations beyond the peninsula. The exact purpose of this video is to separate the documented history from the folklore surrounding each place, while preserving the quiet atmosphere that lets you listen, relax, and fall asleep. So, listen for the pattern. Charleston's mysteries are not only about ghosts, they are about what a city remembers when its official history leaves people, rooms, and entire communities in the margins. We will follow those traces from the harbor to the graveyards, from the grand houses to the cabins, and from the stories people repeat to the evidence they can actually point to. Let your shoulders drop. The walk begins at the water's edge. For the next 2 hours, the route is simple. Begin at the harbor, move through the oldest streets, descend into the rooms beneath them, and finish among the oaks and marshes beyond the peninsula. Every stop will give you 3 things: what Charleston's records preserve, what local tradition adds, and why the mystery still survives. Nothing needs to be solved tonight. The point is to listen closely enough to hear where history ends and memory begins. If you have been enjoying this slow walk through the city with me, leave a like on the video. It tells the algorithm that stories like this one deserve to keep being made, and it lets the channel keep growing. Subscribe if you would like more walks like this, and if you would like to read the deeper history of American cities like Charleston, the stories that don't always fit on a screen, there is a free PDF ebook series linked in the description below, A Quiet Little Library of America's Forgotten Places. Drop the name of the city you are listening from in the comments, and let me know what the night sounds like where you are. We will keep walking. Near the corner of Archdale Street, not far from King, there is a low brick wall, and behind the wall is a graveyard that most people walk past without noticing. This is the Unitarian Church Cemetery, and it is one of the oldest sections of consecrated ground still standing in Charleston. The graves inside are crowded close together, and the headstones lean at odd angles, because the earth beneath them is soft and sandy, and because the people who were buried here died a long time ago, in the late 1700s and early 1800s, when Charleston was still a young colonial town and the ocean was closer to this part of the city than it is today. Behind that wall, the Unitarian graveyard is famous for 2 reasons. The first is that Edgar Allan Poe is widely believed to have visited this place when he was stationed at Fort Moultrie in the late 1820s, and many people, including historians who have spent decades working on the question, believe that the last woman he loved is buried here. Her name was Annabel Lee, or at least, that is the name that Poe gave her in the poem he wrote late in his life. Her real name is thought by some scholars to have been Anna Ravenel, a young woman from one of the old Low Country families, and her family plot is here, behind this brick wall, beneath one of the great sweeping oaks that has been dropping its leaves on the stones for 200 years. If you have ever read the poem, you may remember it. It was many and many a year ago, in a kingdom by the sea, that a maiden there lived whom you may know by the name of Annabel Lee. The poem goes on to say that she loved him and that he loved her, and that the angels in heaven were jealous of the 2 of them, and that they sent a chill down from the sky, and that she closed her eyes in the kingdom by the sea. The poem never says where the kingdom is, but Charlestonians have always believed that the kingdom is theirs. There is, of course, no proof. There is only a pattern of coincidences that is hard to dismiss. Poe was stationed here in 1827 and again in 1828. Anna Ravenel's family lived here. Her name begins with the same letters as Annabel Lee. She died young. The churchyard where she is buried is the kind of place that Poe would have loved. Mossy, romantic, half-forgotten, somewhere a writer would go to think. And the poem Annabel Lee was the last poem Poe ever wrote, which means that of all the things he left behind before he died, this was the image he was holding in his mind at the very end. A second reason this graveyard is famous is the Lady in White. Visitors and tour guides and staff members at the church have been reporting a figure in white drifting between the stones for over a century. She is described as tall, pale, half-transparent, moving very slowly, often in the early evening when the light is low. Nobody is sure who she is. The official story is that she is one of the women who is buried here. The unofficial story, the local story, the one that has been told in this city for generations, is that she is Anna Ravenel, and that she is still waiting. By daylight, the graveyard is open to the public. You can walk in through the gate on Archdale Street, and you can stand among the stones, and you can read the names that have been weathered by 2 centuries of wind. Some of the epitaphs are too faint to read. Some have been worn away entirely, and the graves they marked are anonymous now, which is, in its own quiet way, the most haunting thing of all. You do not have to believe any of the stories to feel something here. A graveyard is a place where time stops being abstract and turns into weather you can see. The stones get older every year. The oaks drop more leaves each autumn. The names fade, and yet the ground holds them, the way the city holds everything it has ever been given. Across the street from the city market, on Magazine Street, there is a long yellow building with thick iron bars over the windows. This was the old Charleston City Jail, and it is one of the most haunted places in the city. It is also, according to a story that has been told over and over again for almost 200 years, where the first female serial killer in the United States spent her last nights on Earth before she was led out the door and hanged in 1820. Her name was Lavinia Fisher. She was the wife of a man named John Fisher, and together they ran an inn called the 6 Mile Wayfarer House on the King's Highway just outside the city. In the early 1800s, Charleston was booming. Travelers moved up and down the King's Highway between Charleston and points further inland, and the inns along the way depended on that traffic. The Fisher's Inn was known for being warm and welcoming. The rooms were clean, the food was good, the beds were comfortable, and the welcome was, depending on which version of the story you believe, the last thing a great many travelers ever received. According to the legend, the Fishers robbed and murdered their guests. They lured strangers inside, offered them a drink, and then did to them what they did. The number of victims is never agreed upon because the legend has been told and retold for so long that the count slides from version to version. Some old accounts say 12, some say more. What is not in dispute is that the Fishers were arrested in 1819 and that Lavinia was tried separately and that she was found guilty and that on the morning of February 18, 1820, she was hanged in front of a crowd that stretched all the way back to the city market. And then the story continues. On the morning of her execution, according to the legend that has been told in Charleston for 2 centuries, Lavinia was asked whether she had any last words. And she said that she would return, that she would haunt the city from beyond the grave, that her presence would be felt in the rooms where she had waited, and in the hallways where she had been locked away, and in the jail itself, which was at that moment still being built around her. Whether she actually said these words, or whether they were put into her mouth later by storytellers who wanted to make the story last, is one of the questions that no one has ever been able to answer with any certainty. But the jail reserves her. In any case, today, the Old City Jail is a museum. You can walk through the rooms where she was held, you can see the cell where she is said to have spent her final nights, and you can see the heavier, quieter cells on the upper floors, where she is reported to have been kept alone in the days before her death. Staff and visitors have reported cold spots that move through the hallways in ways that have nothing to do with the drafts from the broken windows. They have reported a smell of perfume in rooms where there is no perfume. They have reported the sound of laughter from empty rooms and the feeling of being watched from behind, even when the hallway behind them is empty. Some of them have reported seeing a woman in a long, dark dress, standing at the far end of a corridor, just for a moment, before she is gone. There is also a ghost at the Old City Jail who has nothing to do with Lavinia Fisher. He has been seen in the upper floors of the building, in the men's cells, and he is described as a small, angry man with wild eyes and a limp. Some say he is one of the prisoners who died here in the years after Lavinia, in the long decades when the jail held runaway slaves, debtors, and the unfortunate. Some say he is the undertaker, the man whose job it was to come in and collect the bodies of those who died in their cells. He is said to dislike being observed, and he is said to move quickly when he is seen. The jail is closed at night. If you walk past it, the windows are dark, the bars are still on the windows, and if you stand on the sidewalk for a long moment, with the wind off the harbor coming up the street, you can just barely feel the building breathing. That may not be a haunting. It may just be the way the wood expands in the salt air of Charleston, the way old buildings have always done. Or it may not. There is no way to settle it. That is why we are walking here tonight. Stand at the corner of Church Street and Queen Street and look up. You will see a long pink stucco building with arched windows and a balustrade along the roofline, and across the front of it, in elegant raised letters, the words Dock Street Theater. This building has been a theater for almost 300 years, which makes it one of the oldest theater buildings in the United States. The current structure was put up in 1809, but the land beneath it became a theater in 1736, when the first iteration of the building opened with a performance that the city's records describe, in their careful way, as an artistic triumph of the colonial period. But before it was a theater, this building was a coffee house, the Planters' Coffee House, and the coffee house was the heart of Charleston's social and political life in the early 1700s. Traders, planters, politicians, and operators of every kind passed through the front door, and many of the most consequential decisions in the early history of the colony were made in the rooms upstairs. And then in 1809, the building was destroyed in the Great Fire that swept through the city during the evacuation of the Confederate forces, and for almost 50 years the lot stood empty, until it was rebuilt as a theater. The reason we are stopping here tonight is because the theater has a ghost. The story is that he came back in the 1830s, and that he has been here ever since. His name was Junius Brutus Booth, and he was, in his day, one of the most famous actors in the English-speaking world. He was also British, an English Shakespearean actor who had crossed the Atlantic in 1821 to tour the American stage. He had his home base at Tudor Hall in Maryland, but he traveled constantly, and he appeared at theaters up and down the East Coast, including, on at least one documented occasion, the Planters Hotel, which is to say, the building that stood on this spot before the current Dock Street Theater was built. He was known for playing Richard III, Hamlet, and Lear with a ferocity that audiences found both thrilling and a little frightening. He was also, in private, a troubled man. He drank heavily. He suffered from what we would now recognize as severe depression. He was, in his own time, considered dangerous. But that is not why we are here. The thing about Junius Brutus Booth that has been kept alive in this city, the thing that the tour guides have been telling visitors for almost 2 centuries, is that he was not done with Charleston. There is no record of his death at the Dock Street Theater. He died in 1852 on a riverboat in Missouri, far from here. But his presence is said to remain. Staff and performers at the Dock Street Theater have described, again and again, a heaviness in the third-floor stairwell, a feeling of being followed down the corridor that leads to the dressing rooms, a sense of a presence standing just behind, just out of sight. Actors who have slept in the building late at night after performances have described a smell of brandy in the hallway, even when no drinks have been poured in the building. And on several occasions, in the years since the theater was restored, visitors have reported seeing a man in a long, dark coat standing at the edge of the stage when the stage is empty, watching the rows of seats as if he were waiting for a performance that is never going to begin. Tonight, the theater sits dark, the same as it has on most nights since the fire that destroyed its predecessor. But stillness in a theater is not the same as silence. A stage is built to hold sound. A curtain is built to fall. A dressing room mirror is built to be looked into. And for almost 200 years, according to the people who work here, the third-floor stairwell has belonged, just a little, to an actor who never got to finish his last performance in this city, and who may still be waiting to come back and finish it, walk down to the southernmost tip of the peninsula, past the houses on the Battery, past the great pink mansions with the iron gates, and you will reach a small green park laid out between two bends of the harbor. The park is called White Point Garden, and the promenade that runs in front of it is called the Battery. From this point, you are looking out at the water, the same water that every generation of Charlestonians has looked out at and seen ships and wars and storms and the slow return of the tide. The Bunker Hill Monument, the Palmetto Guards Monument, the statues of the generals, all of them face east, because east is where the danger always came from in this city's long history during the Civil War. After the bombardment of Fort Sumter in April of 1863, the houses on the Battery were turned into hospitals. They had been mansions, and they became long, low rooms where wounded soldiers were laid out on whatever flat surface was available, and where the women of the city walked the floors with basins of warm water and met the eyes of men who were too young to be dying. Some of those soldiers did die. Some of them died in the parlors, and some of them died in the bedrooms, and some of them died in the gardens out back, where the magnolias were blooming. The families who lived in those houses did not forget, and according to the people who have lived in them since, neither did the soldiers. If you stand on the porch of the Battery Carriage House Inn at 20 South Battery and you look east across the harbor, you are looking at the same view that the family inside the house has been looking at since 1843. The inn has been the site of some of the most consistent reports of a single ghost in the city. The story is that a Confederate soldier was killed on the lawn in front of the house in the early months of the war, and that he has been a presence at this address ever since. Guests who stay in the rooms on the upper floors have reported seeing a man in a gray uniform, standing at the end of the bed, watching them sleep. The apparition is described as quiet, not hostile, and as a general rule, he does not speak. He just stands. The innkeepers, who have kept a careful log over the years, say that he shows up most often in February, around the anniversary of the bombardment of Fort Sumter, and in the late evenings, when the house is empty of visitors, walk a few steps further down the promenade, and you reach the second ghost of the Battery. This one is said to be the ghost of a young woman who died in one of the houses on the South Battery during the yellow fever epidemics of the early 1800s. She has been reported as a pale figure in a long white dress, drifting between the houses on the eastern edge of the promenade, and she has been doing it, according to local accounts, for almost 200 years. She does not interact with the living. She does not speak. She simply appears, and then she is gone. The most common times to see her are in the very early morning, when the sun is coming up over the harbor and the lamps are still lit, and in the evenings, when the lamps are being lit and the sun has just gone down. She has been seen by visitors, by longtime residents, and by members of the police who have patrolled this stretch of the Battery for decades. And then there is the third ghost. He is associated with one of the houses on the South Battery that was used as a hospital, and he is described as a man in a long dark coat with a beard who paces back and forth across the lawn in the evenings. He has been seen so often that the current owners have stopped reporting him. He simply walks, they will tell you, and if you sit on the porch and watch, you may see him yourself, if you are patient and quiet. The way the porch was built to be sat on, and the way the lawn was built to be walked on, and the way Charleston was built ever since its founding to hold the slow procession of the dead. Nowhere in Charleston is the passage between centuries as literal as it is at the corner of Church Street and Trad Street, where an old clapboard building with a swinging sign has been doing business as the Pirate House Tavern since 1931, and where the building itself has been doing business as something else since well before that. The dates on the timbers, as far as anyone has been able to tell, run back into the late 17th century, and one of the timbers bears a date of 1692, which would make this structure one of the oldest surviving wood frame buildings in the entire city. There has been a place to drink here, according to local legend, since pirates were drinking here, which is to say since the days of Captain Edward Teach and Charlestown's role as the ransom capital of the early Atlantic, the story that heralds the place more than any other concerns Blackbeard. In the spring of 1718, Edward Teach, Blackbeard, sailed a small fleet of ships into the mouth of the Charleston Harbor with a plan that was, by the standards of his era, unusually theatrical. He did not attack the city. He did not burn the harbor. He blockaded it. He captured a number of citizens of the city, took them hostage on his ships, and then sent a small party ashore to deliver a ransom demand. A chest of medicine delivered to him on board his flagship in exchange for the hostages. The city, which had little choice in the matter, complied. The medicine was delivered. The hostages were released. And Blackbeard sailed away, a procedure that has been recorded in the records of the South Carolina colonial government, and that is, depending on which historians you ask, either an act of piracy or an act of state. According to the legend, Blackbeard spent several of those nights in the building we are standing in front of. And the legend does not end there. The story continues to say that there are rooms beneath the building that connect it to a private dock on the harbor, and that Blackbeard used these passages to come ashore without being seen. Whether these passages ever existed is one of those questions for which the answer swings between of course they did and no proof has ever been found. The building does have a low cellar. The cellar does have bricked over archways. And the harbor is, even today, only a short walk from this front door. Look at the second floor of the building. If you stand across the street, there is an empty window frame that has never had a pane in it. The story is that Blackbeard kept a candle burning in the window at the back of the house in order to light the path of any of his crew who were coming in late from the harbor. According to the version that has been told in this neighborhood for the longest time, the window has been empty because the candle has always been there, behind it. Even though no one can see a candle in the window now. There is no candle on the windowsill, but on some nights, some of the people who have worked at the tavern say they have seen a small, steady light in the window, even though they are looking at the window from outside, and there is no electricity in the room behind it. There is also the story of Anne Bonny, the Irish-born woman who dressed as a man, served aboard the pirate ship of John Rackham, and is said to have left Charlestown behind for a different life on the open sea. According to some accounts, Anne met her husband in Charleston before she went on the account. According to others, she was born in Ireland and did not set foot in the American colonies until after she had abandoned her husband and joined the crew of Rackham's sloop. The city's historians have been arguing about which of those versions of the story is true for as long as anyone can remember. The point that everyone agrees on is that the story is true, and that the woman existed, and that she was, by all accounts, ferocious. The most famous line associated with Anne Bonny comes from her trial in 1720 in Jamaica. When she was sentenced to hang, she is reported to have looked at Rackham, who was also sentenced, and to have said that she was sorry to see him there, but that if he had fought like a man, he would not have been hanged like a dog. The line has been repeated, in slightly different shapes, for 300 years. Whether she actually said it is a question that more polite historians have answered by leaving it in the space between fact and legend, where most of Charleston's most fascinating stories live. From the middle of Charleston Harbor, on a small man-made island made of more than 70,000 tons of imported stone and brick, there stands a fort that almost no one lives in, that almost no one works in, and that almost everyone in the United States knows the name of. This is Fort Sumter, and the whole country knows what happened here. Because what happened here began the Civil War. On the morning of April 12, 1861, the bombardment began when Confederate forces, having taken position around the harbor during the winter, opened fire on the Federal garrison that was still inside the fort. The garrison, under the command of Major Robert Anderson, held out for 34 hours before surrendering. The surrender ceremony itself happened on April 13, when the garrison marched out, the drums rolling, and the Federal flag came down and the new flag went up. The first casualty of the war, a private named Daniel Huff, was killed not by enemy fire, but by his own gun during the surrender ceremonies. He fell on the parade ground. He is thought by many to still haunt the place where he fell. Across the interior of Fort Sumter, visitors report faces without prompting. They are described as impressions in the brick walls of two of the interior rooms of the fort, faces that look human from a distance of about 10 or 15 feet, that resolve into a smear of mortar when you step closer. The faces have been there, according to people who have worked at the fort for years, for as long as the walls themselves have been standing. There is no photograph that does them justice. There is no explanation that satisfies everyone. Some of the park rangers who staff the fort will tell you, if you ask them on a quiet afternoon, that they have walked past the same face enough times that they can no longer look at it straightforwardly. Some of them will say that the face is the face of Daniel Huff, the soldier whose own weapon made the first wound of the war. Some of them will say that it is the face of one of the Confederate gunners whose own shell came back across the harbor and killed him instead. Still, the most consistent ghost on Fort Sumter is the ghost of General Pierre Gustave Toutant Beauregard, the Confederate officer who ordered the original bombardment. Beauregard was a French Creole from Louisiana. He had been educated at West Point. He had served as a superintendent at the United States Military Academy at West Point 2 years before. He was the most capable artilleryman in the Southern Army, and it was his decision, made on the morning of April 12, 1861, to fire on Fort Sumter. He did not die at Fort Sumter. He died in 1893 in New Orleans, and he is buried there. But he has been seen, according to the Rangers and the staff, in the second floor of the officers' quarters, on the southwest wall of the building, looking out across the harbor toward Charleston. Visitors to the fort, when the fort is open to the public, are brought across the harbor by ferry. They are let off at the dock, and they walk up a wide flight of stone steps, and they walk through the brick archway, and they are inside the fort. They see the parade ground where Huff fell. They see the magazine where the powder was kept. They see the embrasures where the guns were placed. And on quiet afternoons, in the late hours before the last ferry goes back across the harbor, some of them will tell you that they have heard the sound of drums that did not come from anywhere. They will tell you that they have heard a cannon fired from the brick wall of the second floor quarters that has no cannon in it. They will tell you that they have seen, briefly, a tall figure in a long coat standing in one of the interior rooms, looking out across the empty harbor. We are not going to settle which of these stories is real. Charleston never does. The city simply holds them, the way that it holds everything, the way that the harbor holds the tide, the way the fort holds the place where the first American war of the modern era began. Most people who come to Charleston today, even those who study the city seriously, do not know that the city was almost completely destroyed by an earthquake in 1886. The earthquake happened on August 31, 1886, at 10 minutes before 10 at night, and it lasted, by some accounts, for almost a full minute. By the time it stopped, the city was in ruins. 60 people were dead. More than 2,000 buildings were damaged or destroyed, and the damage was not confined to Charleston. The shaking was felt as far away as Boston, Milwaukee, and Cuba. To this day, the 1886 Charleston earthquake remains the most damaging earthquake to have ever occurred in the southeastern United States, and it remains the largest earthquake ever recorded on the east coast north of Florida. Beneath the city, an unmapped fault produced the earthquake that no one knew was there, and no one has yet been able to map completely. The fault line runs from roughly northwest to southeast, beneath the peninsula, beneath the harbor, beneath the parts of the city that had been built up since 1670. When the fault moved, it moved abruptly, and the city above it was thrown up and then dropped. Buildings collapsed, bridges fell. The rails in the rail yards were bent into long curves. The brick walls of the older buildings shattered. Some of the foundations of the larger houses sank into the sand and never rose again. The accounts from that night read, even now, like a thing out of an older century. People were thrown from their beds. Chimneys came down through roofs and into rooms where whole families had been sleeping. A train on the rails east of the city was thrown off the tracks. The windows of every major commercial building on King Street were broken. The fire engines could not reach the fires because the streets were too broken. The telephone system was gone. The water system was gone. And the city, which had been one of the wealthiest in the South before the Civil War and which had been struggling ever since, was put down again. One haunting account of the night comes from the diary of a young woman on the western edge of the city who wrote that for several seconds before the shaking began, she heard a sound that she could not place. She described it less as a noise than as a feeling in the floor. She and her family made it out of the house with no injuries. Within 40 seconds, the house was in ruins. What has been hardest for the historians of the event is not the magnitude of the disaster, but the recovery. The city, which had been devastated by the war 20 years earlier, was already on its knees. The earthquake finished the work that the war had begun. Whole neighborhoods that had been rebuilt after the war were destroyed again. Whole families that had survived the war and the yellow fever epidemics were undone by the shaking. Almost half the city's population would, in some way or another, leave Charleston in the 20 years that followed. Afterward, the earthquake left the city in a way that no other single event has, more breakable. The great houses that survived the war were broken by the shaking. The brick walls that still stand in some of the older neighborhoods are still, in the engineer's language, partially compromised. Some of the streets of the lower city are still, technically, in the same shape they were in on the morning after the earthquake. The asphalt has been laid over the cracks, but the cracks are still there, beneath the surface, in the shape they were bent into on the night of August 31, 1886. And if you walk down some of those streets late at night, when the traffic is quiet and the only sound is the wind off the harbor, you can feel, if you are the kind of person who feels things like this, the cracks underneath your feet. Even now, the ghosts of the 1886 earthquake are not the most famous ghosts of Charleston, but they are among the most numerous. There are houses in the lower part of the city where the floors are said to tilt slightly and where objects on shelves have been known to roll on quiet nights, as if the earth beneath them is still settling. There are houses where the sounds of the earthquake are said to return, briefly in the evenings, a long, low rumble that begins in the floor and then rises. There are people who have lived in the city all their lives, and who will tell you, without any theater at all, that they have felt the floor move beneath them more times than one, in the same houses that were rebuilt after 1886, in the same walls that were patched after the shaking stopped, in the same cracks that never quite closed. Before Charleston was a port, it was considered by the British to be a good place for a port. Before that, it was considered by the Spanish to be a good place for a port. And before that, it was, for almost 150 years, a place defended only by the natural curve of the water and by the fact that few Europeans had bothered to settle the low country south of Virginia. The first English settlement lasted less than 20 years. The French tried to claim the area in the 1680s. The Spanish tried to take it back in the 1690s. Pirates tried to take it in the early 1700s. And every one of those attempts left a mark on the long, slender stretch of sand between the two rivers. Of the pirates who passed through Charleston in the early 1700s, Stede Bonnet is the one whose end is most firmly attached to the city. Bonnet was a well-to-do planter from Barbados who decided in 1717 that he would prefer a life at sea to the life he had inherited. He bought a sloop, fitted it out with 10 guns, and began to prey on shipping along the American coast. He had no training. He had no crew that respected him. He was, by all accounts that survive of him, a man who was constantly seasick. He was not a particularly successful pirate. He was, however, persistent. He was captured in the fall of 1718, taken to Charlestown, tried at the old Exchange Building, and hanged on December 10, 1718. The hanging took place on the edge of the harbor, in a place that is still marked, and Bonnet's body was buried in a small sandbank overlooking the water in such a way that the tide has, over the centuries, been gradually eating his grave away. The story that has been told in Charleston about Stede Bonnet since his death has never been a simple story. Some observers at the time wrote that Bonnet broke down at the gallows. Some wrote that he was steady. Some wrote that he asked forgiveness and gave the minister who attended him a small collar of gold to keep. The collar has never been found. The accounts of his behavior that night have been argued over by historians for as long as there have been historians in Charleston to argue about them. What has not been argued in the same period is that he has been seen on the marshlands on the eastern edge of the harbor, looking out toward where his ship was captured. Witnesses, almost all of them fishermen who work the marsh in the early morning hours, have reported seeing a man in a long coat and a broad hat standing in the shallow water where the marsh grass meets the open harbor. The figure has been reported so many times that it has become part of the lore that the locals share with one another on the docks. He is not described as threatening. He is described as melancholy and as somewhat confused, as if he has been looking for a ship that he can no longer find. On the quietest evenings of the year, when there is no wind and the water is still, some of the fishermen will tell you that if you walk the marshland at dusk, you can hear him still, faintly, calling out names of people he lost. His second in command, an Irishman named Robert Tucker, was also tried and also hanged in Charleston in the year that followed. Tucker's grave is in the same general sandbank as Bonnet's. The Charleston folklore tradition holds that the two men sometimes appear together. The way it is usually described, they are seen standing at the water's edge, looking out toward a vessel that has never been there in any living person's memory. They do not speak. They do not interact with anyone. They simply look out to sea. Two more pirates would be hanged in Charleston in the years that followed, including Richard Worley in 1719. The graveyard on the White Point of the harbor, the same White Point that is now White Point Garden, was, for a time, the formal burial ground for executed pirates who had met their end at the end of a rope in Charlestown. Many of the bodies were buried there. Most of the graves are unmarked. The ground has been reworked by the centuries. The headstones are gone. The names have been left to the historians, who have been arguing about which of the stories are real and which are fully invented for almost as long as the city has been standing. This is the strange part about Charleston when you walk it at night. The strangeness is not in the ghosts. The ghosts are quiet. The strangeness is in the fact that the city does not seem to mind them. The streets were laid out over the bones of pirates, and over the bones of enslaved Africans, and over the bones of soldiers who died inside the houses that are now hotels. The walls of the buildings are made of the bricks from houses that burned. The foundations of the houses are made of the ballast that came in with the slave ships. Charleston is a city that has been rebuilt over and over out of its own ruins, and the ghosts of every rebuilding are still there, underneath the sidewalks, underneath the foundations, underneath the asphalt, waiting for whoever stops to listen. For a long time, the most popular urban legend about Charleston was the legend of the tunnels. The story went like this. Beneath the streets, beneath the cellars of the houses, beneath the foundations of the warehouses and the churches and the old municipal buildings, there was a continuous network of tunnels that stretched from one end of the peninsula to the other. The tunnels had been built in a century no one could quite name. The tunnels were used in a way no one could quite describe. And the tunnels ran, by some accounts, all the way out to the harbor, where they opened onto small private docks in buildings where the patrons of the tunnels did business that they did not want to do in the open air. Most of the tunnels, as far as anyone has ever been able to establish, were never tunnels. They were cisterns, they were the rainwater collection systems of the old houses, and they were built low and narrow in order to give the household year-round access to fresh water when the surface sources were unsafe. The cisterns in the older neighborhoods of Charleston are sometimes 3 stories deep, and they connect, in some cases by accident or by the geography of the early property lines, to the cisterns of neighboring houses. The legends grew from those connections, but there is a second stratum of underground space in Charleston that is real, and that does connect, in a meaningful sense, the buildings of the old city. The first is the system of drainage tunnels that was built in the late 19th century in response to a wave of epidemic disease that had hit the city repeatedly during the cholera outbreaks of the 1830s and 1840s. The system was designed, and this is the part of the story that is documented, to carry the city's wastewater out to the rivers, away from the densest neighborhoods, on the principle that the waste could be carried away more reliably if it ran downhill. The tunnels that were built for that purpose are still in place. They run for miles. They are bricked and arched. They are wide enough in some sections for a person to walk upright, and they connect, in some parts of the city, almost continuously, according to the people who have worked on the drainage system over the decades. The tunnels are not hard to find. The trick is to know where to look. In some places, the tunnels are still accessible from behind the paneled walls of older commercial buildings. In other places, they have been sealed for years, only to be reopened by a renovation or a road repair project. And in at least one famous section of the city, beneath the old hotel district near the city market, a developer who was digging a foundation in the late 1990s broke through into a section of tunnel that hadn't been entered in living memory, and that has not been entered since. The developer sealed the breach. The tunnels are still there. There are also the cellars. The cellars of the older houses in Charleston are, in many cases, deceptively deep. The cellars of the houses on Church Street, Trad Street, and Lower King Street have been measured at depths of more than 15 feet below the present-day grade of the sidewalk. Some of the cellars connect, through bricked-over doorways and lintels, to the cellars of adjacent houses. Most of the cellars open directly onto the original street grade of the late 17th century, which means that they are, in some houses, more than 3 feet taller than the houses that have been built on top of them. According to the stories that the tour guides tell, the tunnels were used at various points for the smuggling of goods from the harbor to the warehouses, the transportation of enslaved Africans from the dock to the slave pens, the movement of the liquor trade during Prohibition, and the storage of goods that were too expensive to hold above ground. None of those uses can be entirely proved. All of them are nonetheless plausible, given the geography of the old city, and given the limited number of ways that small parties could move large amounts of goods quietly through a neighborhood where everyone watched each other. The most famous of the tunnels, in the legend, is the tunnel that is said to run from the basement of the pirate house to the harbor. The tunnel is, according to some versions of the legend, a real thing. According to other versions, the story is just one more way that the city remembers the pirates who passed through it in the early 1700s. The basement of the pirate house does have a low arch that goes deeper than the floor of the working cellar. The arch is bricked off. The bricks have been there for more than 100 years. Nobody who works at the tavern is willing to say with certainty what is on the other side. At 16 Meeting Street, in the very heart of Charleston, there is a long, 3-story brick mansion with tall windows and iron balconies, and it is known by almost everyone who has ever walked past it as the Calhoun Mansion. The mansion is named after Patrick Calhoun, who built it in 1876, and who was a member of one of the most consequential families in the antebellum South. The Calhoun family produced the 7th Vice President of the United States, John C. Calhoun, who has been called, depending on whom you ask, the most brilliant political theorist the South ever produced, or one of the architects of the American catastrophe. The mansion has been open to the public as a museum and as an event space since the 1930s, and it is one of the most thoroughly preserved single-family residences of the postbellum South. Inside, the house feels tall, quiet, and heavy. The first impression of it is one of solidity. The brick walls, the high ceilings, the long center hall, the floors cut from one continuous piece of heart pine. The second impression is one of shadow. The hallways in the house are always a little dimmer than the hallways in the houses around it. The light that comes through the windows does not quite reach every corner. The tall ceilings hold the cool air, and the long past world of the men and women who built this house and lived in it and walked these floors has not entirely left. According to the Dawsons who work the building, there are several long-running reports of a figure on the upper floors. The figure is described as a woman in a long dress, and she is seen most often at the top of the main staircase, on the 3rd floor landing, looking down into the main hall. She does not approach the visitors. She stands at the top of the staircase and watches. She has been reported so consistently over the years that the docents have begun to include her in a low-key way in their regular tour, without dwelling on her, without manufacturing a story for her, but acknowledging that she is there and that she has been there for longer than most of the people who give the tours have been alive. Staff members have not been able to agree on which of the former residents she is. She may be Mrs. Calhoun herself. She may be one of the daughters who lived in the house for decades after Patrick and his wife had died, and who are known to have married and divorced and outlived their husbands in a pattern that would have been extraordinarily difficult for any woman of the era. She may be one of the enslaved women who worked in the house and who, like many of the people who lived and worked in the great houses of Charleston, are believed to have remained in spirit long after they departed in life. The house does not say. The house simply holds the figure at the top of the staircase, watching the rooms below. A well-known cold spot phenomenon also exists in the building. Visitors walking through the upstairs bedrooms of the mansion have reported, at various points, feeling what the staff calls the cold room, a section of hallway that always feels 10 or 15 degrees colder than the rest of the house. The cold has been measured by instruments on several occasions, and the measurements confirm what the regular visitors have reported. The hallway is colder than the rooms on either side. The cold is most intense around 7 or 8 in the evening, in the winter, when the building is empty. It is not as intense during the day, when the building is full of visitors, and it is not as intense in the summer at all. No explanation given for the cold is entirely satisfying. The mansion is, after all, an old building. The walls are thick. The heating pipes run in some places and not in others. There are drafts, and yet the cold in the upstairs hallway has a pattern that the maintenance staff has been unable to replicate with drafts alone. They have looked for it. They have found drafts in some places, but the drafts do not move at the same time as the cold, in the way that drafts and their associated cold usually move. The cold is, as far as the staff can tell, the cold. On Meeting Street, the mansion sits between the city market and the Battery, and the block it sits on is among the most haunted in the city. The houses in this part of the city were built, almost all of them, by the wealthiest families of the late antebellum period, and the families lived in them through the war, through the yellow fever epidemics, through the post-war poverty, and through the earthquake. Each of those passages left something on the inside of the walls. The houses have been repapered. The houses have been repainted. The houses have been rewired, replumbed, and refloored. And yet the upstairs hallways, the back staircases, the second floor landings, all are heavy. The way the city itself is heavy, in a way that has been carrying the weight of 4 centuries of living and dying. If you drive south from Charleston, away from the peninsula, past the marshes, past the rivers, you come after a little while to John's Island. John's Island is, by area, one of the largest sea islands in the southeastern United States, and parts of it have been settled continuously since the late 17th century. The island has its share of the old plantations, it has its share of the old houses, it has its share of the graveyards, and of the stories, and of the moss-hung live oaks that have been dropping their leaves for 400 years. At the center of Charleston folklore stands Angel Oak, is a tree called Angel Oak, and it stands on a small parcel of land on the western edge of John's Island. The tree has been dated by the United States Forest Service to about 400 years of age, although some arborists believe it is older. The tree is more than 60 feet tall, and its canopy, when fully leafed out, covers a shade area of more than 17,000 square feet. The tree's largest limb is more than 90 feet long and is so heavy that it has had to be supported with a system of steel cables and wooden props since the 1980s. The tree is, by any measure that has ever been applied to it, one of the largest live oaks in the southeastern United States, and one of the oldest living organisms in the South. According to the local tradition, the tree was named after the estate that was built on the land around it, the Angel Estate, named in turn for a family called the Angel family, who had owned the land in the late 18th century. The story that is told about the tree by the tour guides who work the property is that the ghosts of the former owners of the estate still walk the grounds beneath the tree. The names of the ghosts are never quite agreed upon. Some accounts of the legend say that there are 5, that there are only 2, that there are closer to 20. The descriptions are also inconsistent. She is described in some accounts as a tall woman in a long dress, in others as a woman with a parasol, in others as a small child. What is consistent is the location. The ghosts, however they are described, are most often reported at the base of the tree, on the eastern side, where the largest limb runs almost to the ground. The reports come from staff members, from volunteers who staff the property in the afternoons, and from the occasional visitor who has been at the property late enough in the day to be alone. They report being watched. They report the feeling of a presence behind them. They report, in some cases, the sound of children laughing, not the sound of present children, not the sound of any children that there is any other evidence of, but the sound of laughter that is unmistakably distant, in the way that laughter from the deep past is distant. For local communities, the tree is sacred in the local tradition of the people who have lived on these islands for generations, regardless of when they first arrived. The Gullah and Geechee people, the descendants of the enslaved Africans who worked the plantations of the Sea Islands, and who preserved, in remarkable continuity, the language and the customs of their West African ancestors, have a tradition of treating the tree with a particular kind of respect. The tradition holds that the tree is one of the points at which the world of the living and the world of the dead are in closest contact. The tradition is not a story that the people who hold it tell to outsiders, and so it is not described here in any detail. But it is real, it is taken seriously, and it has been honored for longer than the land around the tree has belonged to anyone who is now alive. Across the plantations on Johns Island and on neighboring Wadmalaw and Edisto Islands are full of similar stories. McLeod Plantation on James Island is one of the most thoroughly documented of them, and the stories of the enslaved people who lived and worked there have been preserved by the historians who have reconstructed its history. The best-known ghost story at McLeod involves a small, unnamed girl who has been seen in several of the cabins on the property. The girl is said to have been one of the children who lived on the plantation in the late antebellum period, and she is described as being perhaps 7 or 8 years old. She has been seen by staff and by visitors at the property in the afternoon hours, most often in the kitchen cabin, where she is reported to be moving between the work tables in a way that suggests she is being sent to fetch something. She does not speak. She does not approach the watchers. She simply walks through the cabin. Throughout the Sea Islands, stories are full of the stories. The stories are not, for the most part, frightening. The stories are quiet, almost domestic. They are stories of children in cabins, of women in kitchens, of men walking the fields, of the everyday passages of life that have been preserved in some form on the islands long after the original families have left or died. The Sea Islands are the parts of the Low Country that have been least touched by the rush of the larger cities, and the ghosts of the Sea Islands are the most domestic and the most enduring of all of Charleston's ghosts. North of Charleston, in the town of Mount Pleasant, just across the Cooper River from the peninsula, there is a long brick-walled driveway lined with enormous live oaks, and at the end of the driveway is a long white plantation house called Boone Hall. Boone Hall is a working plantation that has been producing crops since 1681, and it is one of the most photographed single properties in the entire state. The house at its center, with its long symmetrical wings and its broad central porch, has been called the most photographed plantation in the United States. And it is also, according to the people who have spent their lives here, one of the most thoroughly haunted properties on the eastern seaboard. According to the local folklore, there are at least 7 distinct ghosts on the property. The most famous of them is the ghost of an enslaved woman, often identified in the older accounts as Amy, who was an enslaved woman on the plantation in the late 1700s and early 1800s. The legend associated with her, which has been told in the Mount Pleasant area for more than 100 years, is that she fell in love with another enslaved man on a neighboring property, and that their relationship was discovered, and that she was punished by being forced to stand on the 13th step of the front staircase of the plantation house for the rest of her life. The 13th step of the staircase can still be pointed out to visitors who ask. It is the step that is closest to the central landing, and it does have a slight wear pattern that matches the way a single standing position would wear into wood over time. Local tellers say that Amy died on the 13th step. Whether she died there, in fact, or whether the story has been adjusted over the centuries to fit a more dramatic shape than the original events actually had, is one of those questions for which the archives do not contain a clear answer. What the plantation will say, in its modern public materials, is that the story has been told on the property for as long as anyone can remember, and that the 13th step has been walked by visitors, and stood upon by visitors, and photographed by visitors, and that some of those visitors have reported that they felt something there that the rest of the staircase did not give them. Beyond the staircase, Boone Hall has other ghosts, include several that are said to be associated with the brickyard. The brickyard on the eastern edge of the property was operational into the early 20th century, and the enslaved workers who produced the bricks for the plantation house, the very bricks that form the walls of the Avenue of the Oaks, worked in conditions that were extraordinarily difficult. The children of those workers have been reported around the brickyard by staff and by visitors for as long as the brickyard has been open to the public. They are described as small figures running between the old brick kilns. They are most often seen in the late afternoon when the light is at an angle and when the shadows between the kilns are long. There is also a woman in white. The woman in white on Boone Hall is described as a tall figure in a long white dress, sometimes carrying a small bundle, sometimes walking alone. She has been seen on the Avenue of the Oaks at dusk and on the front lawn and at the edge of the marsh. She is reported most often in the late spring, when the azaleas are blooming and the days are long. She does not interact with the visitors. She simply walks. Along the Avenue of the Oaks has its own quiet strangeness. The oaks were planted in 1743 by the original Boone family, and the oaks have been growing continuously for almost 300 years. The oaks have grown so close together that their canopies form a continuous ceiling of moss and leaves. The avenue is a quarter-mile long, and if you walk down the avenue alone in the late afternoon, when the light is failing and the moss is hanging straight down from the limbs, there is a quietness to the place that is a few notches deeper than any of the other quietnesses in the rest of the city. It is not an unsettling quietness. It is the kind of quietness that has weight. The oaks hold it. The oaks have been holding it for 300 years. Take any road out of Charleston, away from the peninsula, past the marshes, past the rivers, and the roads will eventually lead to the Sea Islands, to John's Island, to Wadmalaw Island, to Edisto Island, to St. Helena Island, to Hilton Head Island, to Defusky Island. The people who live on these islands, in many cases, are the descendants of the enslaved Africans who worked the indigo and the rice plantations of the Low Country during the antebellum period, and the language they speak, in many cases, is the Gula language, a Creole language that descends with remarkable continuity from the languages of West Africa, and that has been preserved here in a way that has not been preserved almost anywhere else in the Americas. Across the coast, Gula culture is alive and self-aware and has been studied for years. The basket weaving of the Gula people, the sweetgrass baskets, which are made of bulrush and sweetgrass and pine needles, and which are woven in a continuous coil that descends, in unbroken technical lineage, from the basket traditions of West Africa, are one of the great living folk art traditions of the United States. The Gula cuisine, with its red rice, its shrimp, its oysters, its beni, sesame, and its sweet potatoes, has been one of the single most important influences on the food culture of the southeastern United States. The Gula music, the work songs, the spirituals, the ring shouts, is one of the taproots of the African-American musical tradition. Our reason for stopping on the Sea Islands on this walk is the folktale tradition. The Gula folktale tradition includes a number of small, half-human, half-magical figures of the kind that, in other African-American folk traditions, are sometimes called haints, sometimes called boo-hags, sometimes called plat-eyes, and that have many other names in the different Low Country communities. The most famous of these figures is a figure that, in the Gula tradition, is sometimes called the sign-segger, sometimes called the conjure man or conjure woman, and sometimes, though the term is a tourist term that is not used by the people who actually practice the tradition, the boo-hag. Within that tradition, the boo-hag is not a story that is told to frighten outsiders. The story has, at its heart, a careful structure of social control. The boo-hag, in the tradition, is a person, usually a woman, who has been secretly engaged in acts that are forbidden by the community, and who, when she is discovered, is recognized as having been a boo-hag all along. The boo-hag steals skin. She rides the victims of her witchcraft at night. She hides in attics. She is recognizable in the stories by a small, specific set of warnings. The point of the stories is not to frighten. The point of the stories is to make it clear that the community knows who the boo-hag is, and that the boo-hag knows that the community knows. Folklorists have often been surprised by this feature of the Gula tradition that has, more than once, surprised folklorists who came looking for monsters. The monsters in the Gula tradition are not really about monsters. The stories are about people. The stories are about what happens within a community when the rules are broken. The boo-hag is the figure in whom the community's judgments are incarnated. The boo-hag is the visible punishment. And the reason the boo-hag can be told in the community without anyone being offended is that the buhag is, by the rules of the telling, always someone who is being punished. Not actually a buhag, but understood by everyone in the community to be a person who has been judged. At its heart, the Gula folktale tradition, it does not work, as most ghost story traditions do, by externalizing the monstrous. It works by internalizing it. The horror in a Gullah buhag story is the horror of recognition. The horror is that the buhag is, in some way, someone you know. The buhag is the figure who has done something that secretly everyone knows about. The buhag is recognizably a person, and the buhag at the end of the story is destroyed because she is recognized as having been a buhag all along. Sweetgrass basket traditions, that is part of this same cultural complex, has its own quiet stories. The baskets, which are now sold on the streets of Charleston and at the city market, are made by women whose names and whose families are passed down through the weaving tradition itself. The most famous of the basket weavers, the late Mrs. Louise Jefferson, the late Mrs. Vera Manigault, the late Mrs. Martha Reed, and the late Mrs. Rosetta Clovis, have been the bearers of the tradition that survives. The baskets are sometimes displayed in the older homes that are open to visitors on Edisto and on John's Island. With the small personal names of the weavers stitched into the weave, older baskets were not sold. The baskets were given. A basket was a gift that the weaver gave to a friend, a relative, a sweetheart. The gift carried with it the name of the weaver and the name of the giver and the name of the person who had given the weaver her materials, and so on. The basket was, in the older sense, a continuous record of a relationship. The trade in the baskets, which has been the economic backbone of the Gullah basket tradition for the last 30 or 40 years, has changed the meaning of the basket. But the older meaning is still there. If you are the kind of person who knows how to look, if you are ever in Charleston and you see a basket being woven and you ask the weaver about her grandmother and about her grandmother's basket and about where the basket tradition came from in this family, you may be surprised by the slowness of the answer. The answer is rarely short. The answer is rarely a sales pitch. The answer is, more often than not, a small piece of family history that the weaver holds traceably in continuous line all the way back. On the night of September 21, 1989, Hurricane Hugo made landfall just north of Charleston at Sullivan's Island, and the eye of the storm passed directly over the city. The storm was a Category 4 when it came ashore. It produced the highest storm tide ever recorded in the Charleston Harbor area at that time. In the hours that followed, more than 80% of the homes in the city of Charleston proper, North Charleston proper, and Mount Pleasant were damaged. The downtown historic district, which had been painstakingly preserved for the previous 40 years, was hit with water damage, roof damage, and structural damage on a scale that no one had seen since the 1886 earthquake. The damage to the city was estimated at more than $5 billion in 1989 dollars, which would be more than $12 billion in today's dollars. And the storm, which had been downgraded from a Category 4 to a strong Category 2 by the time the center reached downtown Charleston, was still strong enough to drive water 6 feet deep through the streets of the lower city and to tear roofs off 3 of the historic houses on the Battery. The storm hit at high tide at night, and it struck the city that had been expecting it for 2 days. The city had been through the warning. The city had moved most of its people out of the peninsula by the early part of the day. The bridges had been closed, the shelters had been opened, and still the storm came, with the wind pushing the water over the seawall and into the streets of the lower city with such force that, in places, the water was 6 feet deep inside the houses of the historic district. The boats in the harbor were lifted out of the water and laid on top of the seawall. A large freighter in the Cooper River broke loose of its moorings and was driven aground against the Ravenel Bridge approach. In the days that followed, the city began the long process of cleaning up. Volunteers poured in from across the South. The National Guard came in. The cleanup took weeks, and many of the buildings that were damaged, both on the peninsula and on the islands, had to be rebuilt in ways that, for the first time in the modern preservation era, brought new construction materials and new methods into the historic district. Some of the older buildings could be saved. Some of the older buildings, particularly those along the lower streets of the peninsula closest to the harbor, could not. The storm was the largest single disruption to the historic district since 1886, and the recovery was a long, painful, contested process. Some of the houses were put back exactly as they had been before the storm. Some of the houses were put back with significant changes. Some of the houses were torn down entirely and rebuilt from the foundation up. The downtown of Charleston in 1990 was, in many places, a different downtown from the one that had existed in September of 1989. And the storm, in the lore of the city, has become its own kind of marker. It is the storm that almost everyone who was here at the time will tell you about. The people who lived through Hugo in the historic district describe the storm in ways that are remarkably consistent. A low, steady roar from the harbor, sound that filled the air for hours. A sense, as the water rose, that the city was being overcome in a way they had not imagined. The barometric pressure, in the hours before the storm came ashore, was among the lowest that anyone in the present generation had ever experienced. The pressure readings, taken at the airport on the western edge of the city, were recorded by the National Weather Service at record low levels. Hugo is, in the ghost lore of the city, the storm that is said to have left its own kind of trace. There are houses in the Lower Peninsula where, on quiet nights, even now, the people who live in them will tell you that they can still hear the wind rise, briefly in the eaves. There are houses where the structures that Hugo damaged have been reported as having their own quiet sounds, creaks, taps, the kinds of sounds that old buildings make when the night is cool. There are houses where the photographs of buildings that were lost to the storm have been reported in a small but persistent tradition to have been altered in the years since. The alterations are very small. They are details in the photographs. They are things that no one can prove. But the people of Charleston, who have been watching their city carefully for a very long time, will tell you, without dressing it up, that something in the buildings they rebuilt after Hugo is not quite the same as the buildings that were there in 1989. We are at the end of the walk, and the night has moved on, and the lamps along the harbor are still lit. We are standing at the eastern edge of the peninsula, near the city market, where the old slave mart building is, and where the air always feels a little heavier than the air at any other part of the city. The sky above the city is dark. The water is dark. The windows of the houses are, for the most part, dark. And the city, in this small late hour, has settled into the long quiet that the city has been keeping, in one shape or another, for almost 400 years. Charleston has been through a great deal. Charleston has been colonized, Charleston has been burnt, Charleston has been bombarded, blockaded, shaken, flooded, hit with hurricane after hurricane since the first English settlers began in the 1670s to build a town on the marsh at the edge of the two rivers. And the city has every time been rebuilt. The city has been every time partially destroyed, and it has been every time in the years that followed painstakingly reassembled out of what was left. The bricks of the older buildings, in many cases, are not the original bricks. They are the bricks of the buildings that rose after the fires, the hurricanes, the earthquakes, the wars. The foundations of the older houses are not the original foundations. They are the foundations that were poured, or dug, or laid out of the ballast of the slave ships after each disaster. The ghosts of the city are part of the city, in the same way that the bricks and the foundations are. The ghosts are not the city's ornament. The ghosts are the city's pieces. The ghosts are the parts of the city that did not fit any of the easier historical narratives. The people who lived in the houses, the people who worked in the kitchens, the people who died in the epidemics, the people who fell in the wars, the people who hung from the trees along the harbor, the people who were unloaded from the slave ships, and who worked in the rice fields until they died. The ghosts are the city's preserved memory, and the city has been carrying that memory carefully in the shape of stories for centuries. And tonight we have walked through some of those stories. We have walked past the graveyard where Anna Ravenel is buried, who may or may not be the Annabel Lee of the last poem. We have walked past the jail where Lavinia Fisher waited, and the theater where Junius Brutus Booth paced, and the houses on the Battery where the wounded soldiers lay, and the mansion on Meeting Street where the woman still watches the top of the staircase. We have walked the marshlands where Stevie Bonnet is said to walk, and the plantation fields where the sweetgrass baskets are still being woven, and the avenues where the oaks are still growing, and the streets where the cracks of 1886 are still under our feet. This is, in the end, what the city has to offer. Not an answer, not a single explanation, not a final shaping of the facts. A walk. A slow, quiet, careful walk through a city that has been walking carefully for centuries with one hand on the wall. The history we do not know is often more interesting than the history we think we do. Let us leave the lamp lit by the harbor and let us close our eyes. Let the city fall quiet around us. Let the moss on the oaks settle for the night. Let the slaves who are still buried beneath the streets sleep in the long sleep that no one has ever been able to give back to them. Let Lavinia Fisher, if she is still walking the jail, walk. Let the soldiers on the battery pace. Let the woman at the top of the staircase in the Calhoun mansion stand where she has been standing, and let her not be disturbed. Let the light in the window of the pirate house burn or not burn, as it chooses. Let the building we have been sleeping in, the city itself, settle into the night. Charleston is not finished with us. Charleston will be here in the morning. Charleston has been here, after all, for almost 400 years. There is no hurry. If you stayed awake until the end, leave a like on the way out, and consider subscribing if you would like a slow walk like this one through another American city. There is a PDF ebook series linked in the description below, the quiet kind of local history that the cameras don't always show. Drop the city you are listening from in the comments, and we will keep going. Sleep well. The lamp on the harbor is still lit, and the night is still soft. South of Charleston, deep in the pine woods that stretch toward the coast, there is a small, beautiful arched bridge that stands in a place where there are no modern roads and almost no modern buildings. The bridge is called Poinsett Bridge, and it is one of the oldest bridges in the state of South Carolina that is still standing in its original location. The bridge was built around 1820 by Joel Poinsett, who was the same Joel Poinsett who later became the first United States minister to Mexico and the man after whom the poinsettia plant is named. The bridge is a single arched span made of brick, cut stone, and tabby, and it sits, after 2 centuries of use, in a small clearing surrounded by old live oaks, palmettos, and the long moss-draped cypress trees that grow along the slow brown creek that runs beneath it. The bridge is no longer used by automobile traffic. The bridge is in fact no longer used for any practical purpose at all. The bridge is a landmark. The bridge is the kind of thing that survives because people have decided it is worth keeping. Local accounts of Poinsett Bridge, for at least as long as people have been telling stories in the country south of Charleston, is not a single, well-documented story, the way that some of the legends of the Battery or the Old City Jail are well-documented. The folklore is more diffuse, and it has been told in different shapes by different families. The shapes converge in 2 ways, however. The first is the matter of the bridge's caretakers. The bridge was, according to one version of the story that has been told in the area for more than 100 years, the site of a tragedy. A child died there. A young woman died there. A schoolteacher threw herself off the central arch on a winter night after a complicated and unhappy love affair with one of the sons of a planter family who had built a nearby estate. None of these accounts are the same, but the accounts never fade. The accounts simply shapeshift, as the stories of country bridges tend to do in the southeastern United States, and the bridge keeps them all. A second thread concerns the surrounding country of the country itself. The woods in which the bridge sits, the long stretch of pine savanna and low pocosin that runs south of the city toward Edisto Island and beyond, was in the 18th and 19th centuries one of the more remote landscapes in the southeastern United States. The roads through it were narrow and the houses were scattered, and the people who lived in the area lived primarily from the small plantations of indigo, of cotton, and of longleaf pine lumber. The communities that lived in the area shrank steadily through the 19th and 20th centuries, the way that rural communities in the southeastern United States have tended to shrink as the central cities swallowed up the country. The communities that lived along the creek that runs under Poinsett Bridge have been gone for many decades. The houses are gone, the graveyards remain. The bridge is a single remaining artifact of the network of roads that once connected this part of the Low Country to the rest of the colony. At dusk, the Old Country Bridge has a particular kind of quiet. The quiet has been reported on. Visitors who come to the bridge, who walk across its central arch, and who pause for a moment at one of the parapets, will tell you that the quiet has a feel to it. The quiet has weight. The moss hangs in long curtains from the limbs of the surrounding oaks, dropping straight down for 10 or 15 feet in the still air. The creek below is shallow, and the water moves so slowly that it almost looks still. And if you stand on the bridge at dusk, when the sun is behind the trees and the air has begun to cool, some of the visitors will tell you that they have heard footsteps from inside the woods. The footsteps have been reported by hikers, by visitors who have come for educational tours, by historians who have come for research. The footsteps describe a stride. The footsteps do not slow down, the footsteps do not speed up. They simply continue behind the tree line, parallel to the path that leads away from the bridge, until they fade out somewhere in the woods. From the center of the bridge, we can stand on it together, and quiet enough that we can hear, if we are quiet, the slow water underneath us. The bridge is one of those places that reminds us that Charleston is not only the city. Charleston was the moment it was built, surrounded by country. And the country, like the city, holds its dead in its own way. Across the Ashley River from the peninsula on James Island, there is a small, low-lying parcel of land that has been called McLeod Plantation since the early 19th century. The plantation is unusual among the surviving Sea Island properties in that it was not, in its post-preservation iteration, made into a single-family residence. The plantation was preserved, beginning in the early 2000s, as a site of historical interpretation, and the primary purpose of the site is to tell the history of the enslaved Africans and their descendants who lived and worked on the plantation. The site is one of the few surviving places in the southeastern United States in which the story of the enslaved people, their living quarters, their workspaces, the kitchens where they cooked for the planter family, the yards where they had small personal gardens, the cemeteries where they buried their dead, has been laid out with the amount of care that the planter family's house was usually given. McLeod's cabins are the most singular part of the property. The cabins were built, some of them by the enslaved community itself, in the 19th century. The cabins are made of wood. The cabins are small. The cabins were built, by their very design, to house many more people than the square footage would suggest. The cabins have floors, in some cases, the same heart pine that was used in the planter family's house, that are still walking from above. The cabins have chimneys, in some cases, that are still standing, even where the rest of the cabin has fallen into ruin. And the cabins have, in nearly every case, a small garden plot close by, where the enslaved family who lived in the cabin grew the small vegetables they needed to feed themselves through the winter, and where, in many cases, the descendants of those families have continued to plant something each year in memory, even after the land has been formally given over to the historical site. What persists on the property is not a named ghost story, is not a story about a specific named individual. The most consistent ghost story is a story about the cabins themselves. Visitors who walk through the cabins in the late morning and who come back through them in the late afternoon report different feelings in the same spaces. The cabins feel, on the second walk, inhabited. The light inside the cabins, around 5 o'clock of an afternoon in the late autumn, when the sun is low and the pines are casting long shadows over the property, falls across the cabin floors at an angle that almost no comfortable modern eye is glad to see. The cabins feel, at that hour, partially occupied. Over time, a story has developed, in the years since the property was open to the public, is a story about a small girl who walks between the cabins. The girl is not named in any of the public-facing materials of the historical site. The girl is described by the staff, by the volunteers, and by the occasional visitor who has come late enough in the day to be alone, as small, dark-haired, of about 7 or 8 years old. She is described as moving quietly, without hurry, between the work tables of the kitchen cabin. She is described as wearing a long dress. The girl has been reported on enough occasions that the regular staff members do not deny her existence. They simply say that they have seen her too. There are also stories, on the plantation property, of a man in a long coat who walks along the rice field embankments. The man is described as older. The man is described as wearing the kind of coat that a planter would have worn in the 19th century. A long dark coat, a high collar, a wide-brimmed hat. The man is described as walking slowly and steadily, the way a person walks when they are inspecting a piece of property for the last time. The man has been seen along the embankments often enough that the staff members who manage the property are no longer surprised when a visitor mentions having seen him. They simply acknowledge that he is there. They have not, in any of the years since the property opened publicly, attempted to identify him by name. Along the rice field embankments are one of the historic features of the property that the historians of the plantation have worked hardest to interpret. The embankments are the risen earth that rises between the rice paddies, and the embankments were kept up by the enslaved community for generations, with hand tools and with a continuous, careful labor that the rice agriculture of the Sea Islands absolutely required. The embankments were, in a sense, the work of lifetimes. The embankments held the water that fed the rice paddies, and the embankments broke in heavy storms, and the enslaved people repaired them, year after year, generation after generation. The embankments at McLeod are no longer used for rice production. The embankments are, in the contemporary property, simply the relic of a working landscape that was built by a community of people whose names are barely preserved in the historical record. The ghosts of the embankments are, in that sense, the most poignant ghosts on the property. The ghosts are the ghosts of the people who never got their stories told through any channel other than the land itself. In the very center of the downtown historic district, at the corner of Broad Street and Church Street, there is a grand stone building with a bell tower and a long arched portico on the second floor. The building is the Old Exchange, and it is one of the most historically consequential colonial buildings in the entire United States. The building was built in 1771, at the height of the colonial period, and the building was used, during the years before the Revolution, as the central commercial exchange of the city. The building was also called, in its early years, the Customs House, because the customs collected on imported goods were processed in the building's lower level. The building was the place where the city's leading merchants would meet to compare their cargo manifests, where the city's leading planters would meet to negotiate their rice and indigo sales, and where the city's leading politicians would meet to discuss the matters of the colony. After the Revolution in 1776, and the building became, in the years that followed, the seat of the new state government's deliberations before the capital was moved to Columbia. The Civil War passed through Charleston in 1861, and the building was occupied by the Confederate forces during the war. The building was occupied by the Union forces immediately afterward, and the building was the site of the formal raising of the United States flag over the city after the war was over. Below the building, in the levels that we are now going to walk down into, there is the Old Exchange Dungeon, which is one of the most haunted and one of the most quietly disturbing single spaces in the city. The dungeon is a set of rooms, two of them on the lower level of the building, that were used during the colonial period as holding cells for enslaved persons who had recently been brought from Africa and who were being held in the basement of the building while their sales were being negotiated on the level above. The dungeon is not the only place in the city where this happened. The Charleston of the late 18th century was one of the largest slave trading ports in the entire country, and the slave trading was openly conducted in the central commercial district. The Old Exchange was simply one of the places where the slave pens were located, preserved in the same modern sense that the cabins at McLeod Plantation are preserved. The dungeon walls and the dungeon ceiling are the original materials of the late 18th century. The dungeon has not been refaced in the modern preservation of the property. The dungeon is dark. The dungeon is small. The dungeon's two rooms each have a low ceiling and a single heavy door, and the doors are the original heavy wooden doors of the period. The dungeon is, in effect, a tomb. Local folklore surrounding the Old Exchange Dungeon is one of the most carefully documented folklore traditions in Charleston's modern story. The folklore includes, in its most consistent and most often repeated form, the figure of a young woman who is reported to have hung herself from the ceiling beams of one of the rooms. The story is told in slightly different versions. In some versions, The young woman is an enslaved woman who took her own life rather than be sold away from her family. In other versions, she is a young woman who had been imprisoned for a theft or another crime. In still other versions, she is the spirit of one of the enslaved women who was held in the dungeon during one of the city's periodic slave auctions. What all of the stories agree upon is that she died in this room, and that she is reported in this room by staff and by visitors on a regular basis. Witnesses describe the figure by the staff as a paler than normal shape, often reported in the corners of the room, often described as approximately the height and build of a young woman of about 17 or 18. The staff members of the Old Exchange who work the dungeon tour on a regular basis will tell you, and they are not given to dramatic speech, that they have, on several occasions, seen a figure briefly in the same corner where they were looking at nothing. The staff members will also tell you that they have, on several separate occasions, heard sounds coming from the empty rooms of the dungeon that have not been explained by any of the routine explanations the staff has come up with. The sounds are sounds of impact, light, soft, hollow, but unmistakable. The staff members describe the sounds as occurring sometimes in a rhythm that no one in the building can account for. Daylight tours of the dungeon are conducted in the daylight hours. The tour groups are led down into the basement, and they are met by the small empty rooms, and they are read a careful, well-researched history of the slave trade in Charleston, and they are given a moment of silence at the site where the figure is most often reported. And then they come back up the stairs. The person who leads the tour, if they are one of the more experienced guides, will acknowledge in a low voice that the figure has been reported in this room. The person who leads the tour will not quite promise that you will see her. They will say that they have, on some nights, seen her themselves. They will say that they have heard sounds that are not the wind on some nights. They will say that the cellar in this part of the city has been dedicated to a particular kind of silence for 200 years, and that the silence is the kind that holds the way that Charleston holds all its past, until someone comes in and asks it questions. Walk up King Street, away from the Battery, away from the market, away from the water. The street stretches for more than a mile and a half, and along the way the buildings change. At the southern end, near the Battery and near Broad Street, the buildings are the grand commercial buildings of the antebellum period, 3 and 4 stories tall, with cast iron balcony galleries and slate roof tops. As you walk north, the buildings transition to 2-story brick street fronts. Around Marion Square, the buildings are mostly offices, mostly mid-20th century, mostly less ornate. Then, north of Marion Square, the buildings transition again to single-story brick storefronts, many of which now hold restaurants and small shops, but which were originally built for the small merchants of the city. And further north still, around the campus of the College of Charleston and the Hampton Park area, the buildings become mostly residential, yet the most interesting stretch of King Street, for our purposes, is the stretch that runs through the middle of the historic district, from roughly the intersection of King and Broad northward up to about the intersection of King and Society, with the longest stretch of preserved buildings to be found in the section from King and Market northward to King and Spring. In this section of the street, the buildings are mostly 3 stories, mostly brick, mostly built between about 1820 and 1880, which is to say they were built in the recovery period after the major fire of 1838, which destroyed most of the central commercial district, and they were largely rebuilt in the period before the earthquake. Many of these buildings sustained significant damage in the earthquake and were rebuilt again. On the walls of some of these buildings, painted on the brick or on the plaster of the second floors, you can still see the old commercial signage that the buildings were originally fitted with. Some of the signs are crisp and legible. Some of the signs are so faded that you have to be looking at them to be reading them. Some of the signs are completely gone, leaving only the rectangular impression that the original sign painter painted slightly darker on the wall, slightly more solidly than the rest of the wall around it. Those signs preserve the history on the King Street buildings, is the history of the city's commercial life in the 19th and 20th centuries, painted onto the walls that have held the life in place. The signs were painted by hand. The signs were layered on many buildings, one on top of another, as the commercial tenants of the building changed. The signs were painted at full scale, which means that the wall behind the modern stucco or the modern siding often houses 3 or 4 or 5 different commercial signs applied over one another in sequence. Some of the modern preservation practices of the city have included very careful peel-away work, in which conservators have come in and removed the modern layer of paint to reveal the original commercial signage underneath. The reveal is one of the most arresting sights in the historic district. What is less often discussed about the King Street signage is the storytelling tradition that has grown up around it. Some of the signs of the older businesses, particularly on the second and third stories of the buildings, are reported by visitors and by staff of the buildings where they are to be found to be associated with specific figures. The most famous of these is the woman who has been reported on the upper floors of the building at the corner of King and Society Street, where a small, dark wigged figure has been seen by staff members over the course of several decades. The figure is described as a woman in mid-Victorian dress, with a dark wig or dark hair pulled back, and she has been seen most often in the late afternoon on the second floor landing of the building, near the windows that face east across Society Street. No name is known that anyone working in the building today knows of. She is simply described as a regular. She has been seen by enough people, over enough decades, that the staff of the building no longer treats the reports as remarkable. The figure simply appears in the same way that the figure of Lavinia Fisher simply appeared in the Old City Jail, in the way that the figure of Anna Ravenel simply appeared in the Unitarian Graveyard, in the way that the figure of Junius Brutus Booth simply appeared at the Dock Street Theater. At King and Market, where the City Market building itself stands, there is the most quietly haunted room in the commercial district. The room is one of the ground floor commercial spaces on the western edge of the market. And the room is reported to have been, for 2 centuries, the working office of one of the slave auction firms of the antebellum period. The room is now a retail space. The retail tenants who have occupied the room over the years have reported consistent cold spots in the same part of the room, consistent acoustic anomalies in the same late afternoon hours, and consistent feelings of being watched during the quiet hours of the early morning. The cold spot is in the southwestern corner. The acoustic anomaly is a faint, soft sound that has been described as the sound of someone turning pages. The watching is a heavy feeling, like the feeling in a stairwell when someone who is not on the stairway is glancing at it from a landing above. For 2 centuries, the market, the long, low brick building that runs the length of 2 city blocks, with the small open-air sheds in front of it and the larger covered hall behind, has its own quiet stories. The market was built first in 1804, rebuilt after the fire of 1838, and slightly expanded after the earthquake of 1886. The market has been a working marketplace for more than 200 years. The market has been a place of both commerce and grief, the central place in the city where the enslaved people who had been brought in from the country were sold at auction, where the commercial goods that the city imported were unloaded and sold, where the produce of the surrounding low country was brought in and sold, where the livestock was bought and sold before the stockyards were moved further out of the city in the 20th century. The market is among the most thoroughly documented spaces in Charleston in terms of its commercial history, but its ghosts have never been given a careful inventory. In the southeast corner of the historic district, at 87 Church Street, there is a tall, narrow, 3-story brick house with 2 small wooden doors and a low iron balcony on the 2nd floor. This is the Hayward Washington House, and it is one of the most thoroughly preserved 18th century town houses in the city. The house was built in 1772 by Daniel Hayward, and his son Thomas Hayward, who lived in the house for many years, was one of the signers of the Declaration of Independence. The house is called the Hayward Washington House because George Washington himself slept in it during his visit to Charleston in 1791. The house has been a museum since the 1930s. The house is a beautiful, quiet, carefully preserved single-family dwelling of the late colonial period. Since opening as a museum, the Hayward Washington House has been the site of some of the most consistent and carefully documented paranormal activity in the entire historic district. The house has been investigated by a number of small local paranormal investigation teams over the last 30 years. The investigations have produced a body of reports that the museum staff has, in a marked novelty for any museum property, been willing to share with the visiting public. The reports follow a clear pattern. The most common report from the property concerns the original Hayward family appearing in the upstairs bedrooms. The figures have been reported by both staff and by overnight visitors, who have been given permission, on a small number of occasions, to spend a night in the upstairs bedrooms. The figures have been described as a woman in a long dress, often accompanied by a small child. The woman has been described as moving through the upstairs hallways, in the same direction of travel, with a small repeat of activity that has been reproduced so consistently by the witnesses that the staff has come to refer to her, in the modern institutional documents, as the upstairs regular. The small child who appears with her is described in much vaguer terms, just as a small dark-haired presence, often at the lower edges of the witness's vision, often not directly looked at. Another striking report from the property concerns the kitchen at the back of the house. The kitchen is a separate building attached to the main house by a short covered walkway, and the kitchen is one of the historical features of the property that the museum has preserved at its original late 18th century state. The kitchen is a dark, low-ceilinged building with a large central hearth and a single entrance from the covered walkway. The kitchen has been reported on multiple occasions to have the smell of bread baking in it when no one has been baking anything. The kitchen has also been reported on multiple occasions by the museum staff to have the sound of a fire being stirred or of a hearth being cleaned when no fire has been lit and no one is in the kitchen. The kitchen is one of the more striking locations for this kind of activity in the entire historic district, and the museum's own staff have come to refer to the kitchen activity as the kitchen's own quiet work. Behind the house, the garden of the house is also reported for some activity. The garden is a long, narrow urban garden, carefully restored to roughly the layout it would have had in the late 18th century. The garden contains the kind of plants that the colonial Charlestonians would have used: herbs, kitchen vegetables, a small patch of medicinal herbs, a few ornamental plants. The garden has been reported by visitors to have the consistent presence of what the staff describes as a small woman in a long apron, who is sometimes seen bending over one of the garden beds as if tending to a plant. The woman does not interact with visitors. The woman is described as seeming, in the way the witnesses uniformly describe it, focused on her work. Today, the Hayward Washington House is open to the public, and the tour guides of the museum are, as a rule, willing to discuss the upstairs regular and the kitchen activity with visitors who ask. The tour guides are careful not to overstate the reports. The tour guides are careful not to call the activity supernatural. The tour guides simply acknowledge that in the upstairs bedrooms and in the kitchen, and sometimes in the garden at the back of the house, things happen that the museum has not yet been able to explain through any of the usual historical channels. And then the tour goes on. The tour is, after all, primarily a tour of a beautifully preserved 18th century townhouse. The tour of the building's quiet life goes on. Walk down to the southern end of the peninsula, and you will find one of the most photographed single blocks in the entire United States. The block is a single line of long, narrow, two-story houses on East Bay Street, just north of the corner of Church Street, and the houses are painted in a continuous sequence of pastel colors: pink, mint, peach, butter yellow, lavender, peach again, pink again. The block is called Rainbow Row, and the block has been the principal postcard image of Charleston for as long as anyone in the modern tourism industry can remember. The colors are soft, the buildings are old, the brick walls behind the colors are falling into romantic ruin in places, and the whole effect, when the sun comes over the harbor in the middle of the afternoon and the light catches the painted surfaces, is one of the most perfectly preserved images of an American colonial-era streetscape in the country. Originally, the houses on Rainbow Row were not always painted in soft pastel colors, and they were not always a postcard image. The houses were, for most of the 18th and 19th centuries, plain red brick buildings, gradually falling into disrepair, gradually being made over into tenement housing, gradually being used for the small-scale storage and the petty commerce of the city's less prosperous residents. The houses were, in the antebellum period, often wholly or partly occupied by the enslaved people of the city. The enslaved men and women whose work was in the small crafts of the city, the domestic work in the households of the planters, the dock work of the harbor, and the numerous odd jobs that the city's commercial economy required. The enslaved population of the antebellum Charleston was, in fact, a majority population of the city. The enslaved people outnumbered the free residents of Charleston from the early 18th century right up until the Civil War. And the small, narrow houses on Rainbow Row were, for most of those years, some of the densest housing of the city's enslaved and free black populations. Pastel color arrived in the 20th century. The houses were gradually bought up, one by one, throughout the early 1900s, by a number of wealthy, preservation-minded Charleston families. And the houses were painted in their pastel colors beginning in the 1930s and 1940s. The first house to be painted, by the commonly accepted account of the tradition, was painted by a woman named Dorothy Haskell Porcher Legendre, who bought one of the houses in 1931 and painted it a soft pink color. The pink color caught on. The other homeowners on the same block began doing the same. By the 1950s, the whole block had been painted. By the 1970s, the block had become, in the modern preservation sense, one of the single most photographed streetscapes in the United States, and the block had become one of the signature images of the city. Rainbow Row's folklore has been muted in the modern period, partly because the block has been so heavily trafficked by the camera-toting public. The block has been hard for ghosts to populate, in the conventional sense. The block has been hard for ghosts to populate because the block has been so consistently inhabited, in the active commercial sense, for the modern era. But there are reports. There are always reports. The reports are soft in the way that the folklore of well-trafficked public places is usually soft. One report concerns the sound of footsteps. The houses on Rainbow Row are mostly built with their own private entrances and their own private staircases. The houses are narrow and the staircases are tight and the floors are old heart pine, and they make the kind of consistent creaking sound that old heart pine always makes when weight is put on it. The reports are that on certain nights of the year, when the houses are unoccupied, the sound of footsteps on the old pine stairs is heard in an empty house. The footsteps are described as moving from the ground floor to the second floor, and then from the second floor to the third floor, in the manner of someone walking very slowly up the stairs. The footsteps do not come back down. The footsteps simply move up. The footsteps have been reported by the nighttime neighbors, by the security staff who patrol the block, and by the police who have walked the street late at night. The footsteps have never been definitively explained. Another report concerns the smell in one of the houses on the block. The smell has been described in the witness reports as the smell of jasmine, but it has also been described as a heavier floral smell, the kind of smell that an older perfume would have had. Rose oil, perhaps, or a heavier violet. The smell has been reported in the same single house on Rainbow Row for as long as the current occupants of the house have owned it. The smell is reported most often, like the cold spot in the upstairs hallway of the Calhoun mansion, during the winter and at the late evening hours of about 7 or 8 o'clock. The smell does not always occur. The smell sometimes goes for weeks without happening. And then, on a quiet winter evening, the smell will fill the upper floors of the house, and then it will fade, and then several days will pass, and then the smell will fill the upper floors again. Today, the houses on Rainbow Row are, in the modern sensibility, the very image of the picturesque. The houses are slender, the houses are tall, the houses have window boxes, in many cases, where flowers are grown throughout the year. The houses are painted in their soft pastels, and the pastels reflect in the windows of the houses across the street, and at sunset, the colors of the houses melt together. And beneath the colors, the original houses are still there, in all the ways the original houses were. The houses still carry the creak of the heart pine. The houses still carry the smell of the brick walls. The houses still carry the small, quiet footsteps and the small, quiet scents that have been there, in one form or another, for longer than anyone knows how to tell. Walk north, away from the battery, away from the river, into the section of the older city that lies back behind the College of Charleston. The streets here are still numbered. The streets here are bounded by the older streets whose names we have walked through already. The streets here include Archdale Street, and coming back to where we started, the Unitarian Graveyard, but also other small graveyards, other small historic plots where the people of the 18th century were buried. There is a tradition in this part of the older city that has been told for as long as anyone in the local chronicling of Charleston can remember, that one of the people buried in one of the small graveyards in this part of the city was not, when he died, a Charlestonian. He was a foreigner. And he had been a foreigner long enough that the city itself, it is said, was not entirely comfortable with his being here. According to local tradition, the foreigner's name, according to the version of the tradition that has been kept most consistently alive, was Philip Thickness. He was an English army captain who had been, by the time of his death in 1792, a memoirist, a traveler, an art patron, and a controversialist who had offended enough important people in England that he had decided, in the early 1780s, to move to Charleston. He had bought a small house on the edge of the older city. He had passed his last years here. And he had died here in 1792, and he had been buried by the conventions of the time in the small graveyard of the local parish church, which, in this part of the city, is the cemetery behind one of the small 18th century Anglican churches in the old residential district. Accounts of Thickness's grave have, for a long time, varied. Some accounts say that he was buried with honors. Some accounts say that he was buried with embarrassment because his reputation in England had followed him here. The more interesting tradition is the tradition that the grave has never entirely settled. The headstone of the grave has, according to multiple historical accounts, been reported as moving at night. The headstone of the grave has been reported as tilting forward in a way that the ground around the grave did not tilt, and the headstone was, on at least 2 documented occasions, reset and reset again by the sexton of the parish. The grave has been visited on enough occasions by enough people that the present-day cemetery staff at the church where Thickness is buried will, if you ask, acknowledge the strange reports that have been kept about the headstone. The staff will not promise that the headstone moves. The staff will say only that the headstone has, in their professional experience, required more attention than most of the other headstones in the cemetery. The reason Thickness is interesting is the reason Charleston itself has always been interesting. The reason is that Charleston is one of the few cities in the United States where a foreign traveler of any historical importance could arrive in 1780 and be buried in 1792. Charleston was, by the standards of its time, the largest and most cosmopolitan city on the southern Atlantic coast. Charleston had, for more than 100 years, been one of the principal ports of the British Empire and one of the principal ports of the colonial American economy. Charleston had been a destination for English, French, Scottish, Irish, Welsh, German, and many other settlers over the years. Charleston had been, for a long time, an unusually international city, and Thickness, the English army captain and memoirist and controversialist, was one of the small but consistent figures in the city's 18th century community of foreign-born residents. Thickness's grave, in the modern period, has been marked with a small stone that the present-day stakeholders of the cemetery identified, after a careful search of the cemetery's records, in the early years of the 21st century. The stone is now part of the small collection of stones that the cemetery has marked for the benefit of visitors. The stone is just one among hundreds. The stone is a quiet stone. The stone sits in the long grass at the eastern edge of the graveyard, near the back wall of the church. And the stone, according to the reports that have been preserved in the local oral tradition of the city for more than 200 years, sometimes moves. The stone moves in a way that the ground around it does not move. The stone moves a small distance, and then, days or weeks later, the stone returns to the position it should be in, which requires the sexton to come and reset it to the position the ground has decided it should be in. Some accounts of the stone that I have come across in the long local tradition of Charleston simply say that the stone has a mind of its own. Some accounts say that the figure of an English officer in a long coat has been seen at the headstone on quiet evenings. Some accounts say that nothing has been reported and that the entire tradition is an invention of the tour guides and the historic religious land. The accounts are not the same. The accounts are consistent in only one way. The stone is unusual, and the people who have kept an eye on the stone have not been entirely comfortable with the way it behaves. Around that stone, the graveyard Thickness's stone is one of the small, quiet graveyards of the older city that have been preserved in part because they hold names like Thickness, and in part because they have been preserved by the small but persistent care of the people of the 18th century Charleston parishes who have remained affiliated with the small historic churches of the older city. These graveyards hold the small, quiet names that the guidebooks of Charleston sometimes cite but rarely visit, and the graveyards hold, in the way that all graveyards hold, the small, quiet stories of the people who made the city what it was before the long wars, before the long disasters, before the long rebuilding that has been the city's defining pattern for 4 centuries. West of Charleston, across the Ashley River, in the direction of the south toward Edisto Island, there is a property that is one of the most extensively preserved historic landscapes in the entire southeastern United States. The property is called Magnolia Plantation, and the property has been, since the late 17th century, the home of a succession of plantation families, including the Magnolia family, the Reverve, John Grimke Drayton, and the many generations of Draytons who have, in one form or another, owned the property continuously since the early 19th century. The property is famous for its gardens. The gardens are one of the great horticultural achievements of the American South, and the gardens are known internationally for their azaleas, for their camellias, and for the long, romantic sweeps of the older plantation grounds beyond the gardens. The property is also a working historic site in the more rigorous historical sense, and the property has been, for the last 40 years, the site of a careful and continuous interpretation of the history of the enslaved African community of the property. The property has preserved, in particular, the cabin community of the enslaved people who worked the rice fields, a community of small, low brick houses set into the ribbon of live oaks and cypresses that runs along the western margin of the property, where the enslaved community lived, worked, and in many cases, were buried. The cabins have been preserved in the same careful way that the cabins at McLeod Plantation have been preserved, with the same emphasis on the domestic and the personal, rather than on the administrative. Local folklore says the property is haunted. The property is, in the popular and local folklore traditions, among the most thoroughly haunted properties in the Low Country. The ghosts of Magnolia Plantation include several figures that have been reported across many decades, including the figure of a young woman in white who has been reported on the long approach to the gardens, near the central pond of the garden's water garden. The figure has been reported by both visitors and staff. The figure is described as small and pale, and she is reported as moving slowly through the gardens in the late afternoon, near the pond, and then fading. Another figure is a man in a coat. The man in a coat at Magnolia Plantation is one of the most consistent figures in the entire Low Country tradition, and he has been reported along the rice field embankments of the property for as long as anyone has been keeping records. The man is described as wearing a long, dark coat in the style of the planters of the late 18th or early 19th century. The man is described as walking the embankments slowly, in the manner of someone inspecting the fields. The man is described as walking with no particular haste. The man has been seen by gardeners, by visitors, and by security staff of the property, and the reports have been consistent over the last 40 years. The man is one of the most photographed and most often referenced figures in the entire Charleston ghost folklore, although the photographs that are said to have been taken of him are nearly all inconclusive. A second figure at Magnolia Plantation, the ghost they call the Spanish Moss Lady. The Spanish Moss Lady is reported along the long avenue of the oaks at Magnolia Plantation, an even longer avenue than the one at Boone Hall, with 2 rows of enormous live oaks and a continuous arched canopy of moss. The Spanish Moss Lady is described as a small, pale figure in white. The Spanish Moss Lady is reported most often in the late afternoon, when the moss is dropping straight down and the light is failing the long way. She is described as moving slowly. She is described as moving without interacting with the visitors. She is described as going in a way that the witnesses consistently describe as gently persistent, wherever you are watching for her. Despite the folklore, the gardens are among the most photographed single spaces in Charleston, and they have been the subject of extensive horticultural study, and they have been the staging ground for the modern azalea and camellia festivals of the city. The gardens have, in the modern sense, no pretense. They are gardens. They are beautiful. They are valued because they are beautiful. But the gardens have also been marked by the long history of the people who worked them, and the gardens have been, like the buildings of downtown Charleston, the site of consistent and reliable reports of figures that the modern accounts of ghost activity in the city do not fully explain. Across Charleston's historic district has, in the last 40 years, been transformed into a place of carefully preserved and increasingly luxurious hotel and inn accommodations. The single largest category of the city's hospitality industry is the small boutique hotel, and the boutique hotels of Charleston are concentrated in 3 or 4 principal areas. The high-end historic district around the Battery and around the city market, the small inns around the College of Charleston to the north, the cluster of small inns and bed and breakfasts along the edges of the medical district of Mu C, and the new Roper Hospital. The hotels are, in many cases, the restored buildings of the antebellum period, with the older woodwork, the older plasterwork, and the older staircases intact. The hotels are full of the same energy, the same sound, the same creaking of the woodwork, the same dimness of the corners that the older single-family houses of the city have. The hotels are also, not coincidentally, among the most consistently reported locations of ghost activity in the city. Among the hotel ghost stories, the most famous belongs to the Spectator Hotel, on the corner of State Street and Society Street, which occupies a building that has been at that address since the 1830s. The Spectator has been the site of one of the most carefully documented reports of a haunted guest room in the entire southeastern United States. The guest room at the top of the building, the room on the 5th floor, facing east toward the harbor, has been the site of consistent reports of a small, dark-haired figure in a long dress. The figure has been reported by housekeeping staff, by guests, and by the management of the hotel, and the management has gone as far as to station a small, quiet note in the room about the figure that guests have reported. The note is written in the careful, soft language that the hotel uses in all of its guest communications, in such a way that the guests are not frightened, but they are informed. The figure, the note gently acknowledges, has been reported by a number of guests in this room. The note gently acknowledges that the management has not been able to explain the reports. The note gently asks the guests, in the language of a genuine request, to simply let the figure be. At the Andrew Pinckney Inn, on the corner of Church Street and Pinckney Street, has been the site of another long series of reports of a single-room haunting. The room in question is in the older section of the inn, on the 2nd floor, and the room has been the site of consistent reports of cold spots, of moving objects, and of a faint, brief smell of perfume that has never been explained by the housekeeping staff. The Vandewey Inn, on the corner of Vandew Range and Church Street, has been the site of yet a third such report, a report of footsteps in the older 3rd floor corridor of the inn, where the steps are heard from one end of the corridor and then the other, in the manner of a person walking from one end of the corridor to the other and then turning around and walking back. Finally, the Mills House on Meeting Street, which has been the site of a long series of hotel lobby level reports of a tall man in a coat standing at the corner of the lobby in the evening. The man is described as wearing the kind of coat that a planter of the late 18th century would have worn. The man has been reported by staff and by guests. The man does not speak. The man does not approach the guests. The man simply stands. Some accounts of the man describe him as the former proprietor of the building, when the building was a single-family house. Some accounts describe him as the former owner of the property on which the building was built. Some accounts describe him as a man who has been in the city itself for a long time and who has simply chosen this particular corner of the lobby to occupy in the modern period. Taken together, the hotels have, in the modern folklore of the city's ghost stories, become the most active surface for the modern folklore of ghosts. The hotels have become active because the hotels are the primary place where the modern tourist experience the city, and the hotels have become the primary place where the visitors have the chance to spend a quiet evening in an older building with the older sounds, with the older smells, with the older creaks, and with the older quiet holes in the corners. The hotels are actively marketed as haunted in some cases. The hotels have installed, in some of the rooms in which ghost reports have been consistently logged, small placards about the historical presence in the room. The hotels have, in at least one celebrated case, set aside the guest room in question as a kind of ghost tourism room, with the room being made available to bookers who specifically want to spend a night in the city's most active room. We are walking out of the lower city now, toward the edge of the peninsula, and the morning is coming, and the harbor is starting to light up. The first boats are beginning to move out into the channel on their way to the docks of Mount Pleasant, or out toward the islands where the Gullah communities are still living the lives their ancestors preserved across the centuries of slavery and the century after. The lights of the bridges, the Ravenel Bridge, with its long single span across the Cooper River, and the older bridges behind it, still lit by the older yellow street lamps, are beginning to dim as the morning light increases. The livery of the city, which has been old all night, is beginning to show its age in the new light, the way all old houses always do in the morning, the way all old churches always do at sunrise. This walk has been a slow walk. We have walked, in our time together, from the Unitarian graveyard to the old city jail, to the Dock Street Theater, to the houses on the Battery, to the Pirate House on Church Street, out across the harbor in our minds to the ramparts of Fort Sumter, down through the streets and lanes that bear the marks of the 1886 earthquake, through the tunnels and passages that lie beneath the streets, into the Calhoun Mansion, where the woman still stands at the top of the staircase. We have walked out of the city, into the country, into McLeod Plantation on James Island, into the Avenue of the Oaks at Boone Hall, and back in again through the marshlands, where Stede Bonnet walks at the edge of the harbor, and into the sea islands where the sweetgrass baskets are still being woven in the evening light under the long porches of the Gula basket weavers. Across the peninsula, we have walked the length of the city. We have walked the length of the long 400-year history of the city. We have walked past the slow, patient centuries of the city's quiet accumulation of its everyday past, its bricks and its foundations, its oyster shell tabby walls and its heart pine beams, its wisteria-draped brick walls and its long, slow afternoon light. We have walked past the most famous ghosts of the city, Anna Ravenel in her churchyard, Lavinia Fisher in her jail, Junius Brutus Booth on his stage, the long procession of wounded soldiers on the Battery. We have walked past the quieter ghosts of the city, the figure in the upstairs corridor of a hotel, the woman at the top of a staircase in a long-gone house, the small girl running between the brick kilns at Boone Hall, the figure of a man in a long coat pacing the rice field embankments at McLeod. By now, we have walked through the city that Charlestonians and the visitors to Charleston have been walking through for 4 centuries. We have walked slowly, the way the city itself has been walking slowly. We have walked quietly, the way the city itself has been walking quietly. The whole city, in fact, has been walking quietly. The whole city has been walking quietly with the moss hanging from the limbs and the streets being repaved over the earthquake cracks every few years and the foundations being relaid out of the ballast of the slave ships that have been broken up and turned into brick. The whole city has been walking quietly because the city is full of the people who cannot yet be quiet, the people who are buried in the unmarked graves, the people who were thrown into the unmarked cemeteries along the harbor, the people whose names are on no headstone at all because no headstone was ever permitted. The whole city has been walking with all those quiet people, and the city has been carrying them for the 400 years of its existence. Ahead, we are walking together out of the city. The road that leads out of the city, north toward Mount Pleasant, past Shem Creek, past the marina where the shrimp boats come in, past the long ribbon of marshland along the harbor, will eventually climb the bridge, and from the bridge we will be able to look back, briefly, across the span of water that the founders of the city were the first to look out across. In 1670, when they decided to build a town here, Before any of the wars, before any of the earthquakes, before any of the hurricanes, before any of the slave ships, before any of the guns of Fort Sumter. Now we are going to stop. We are going to leave the city where we left it. We are going to leave the lamp dimmed, and the morning light increasing, and the moss still hanging from the limbs, and the long, slow quiet of the present city still doing its slow, careful work. The night we have walked through is over. The morning is beginning. Charleston is still here. Charleston has been here for almost 400 years. Charleston will be here tomorrow. Charleston will be here, and the lamp along the harbor will be lit again, and a different kind of walk will begin by a different kind of visitor, on a different kind of night, in a different kind of year. The walk will be the same. The walk is always the same because the city is always the city, and the city carries its own quiet weight year after year, as it has been doing for centuries. The history we do not know is often more interesting than the history we think we do. If you walked with me to the end, leave a like on the video and consider subscribing. There is a free PDF ebook series linked in the description below, the kind of long-form local history the cameras do not always show. And drop the name of the city you are listening from in the comments so I know what other corners of America I should walk through next. There are many. The lamps are always lit somewhere, and the moss is always dropping from the oaks. Thank you for staying up late with me. Sleep well. Before we close, a small thing for those of you who have stayed up the longest. The Gullah storytellers used to say that the city does not forget a soul. The city remembers the soul that was sold at the corner of Meeting and Mary. The city remembers the soul that walked back from the marshlands after sundown. The city remembers the soul that fell asleep at the top of a long staircase and was never found. The city remembers each of those souls, and the city has been carrying them in the slow, careful way that the city carries anything for almost 400 years. We have done a quiet kind of honor to those souls tonight simply by speaking their names instead of erasing them, simply by listening instead of rushing past. So if you came here because you could not sleep, and many of us come for that reason, then the city has given you exactly what it has been giving the visitors who come to it from all over the country and the world, which is a long, slow, careful kind of company, the kind of company that walks you through 4 centuries of moss and old brick and never once raises its voice and never once asks you to be anywhere other than the place you are right now, with your head on the pillow and your eyes half closed and the city's long quiet wrapping around you like the moss wrapping around the limbs of the live oaks at Boone Hall. Sleep now gently. The swamp breeze from the marshes will keep coming through the windows for hours. The light from the harbor will keep doing the slow fade in toward dawn. Let all of it wash over you. The city is not finished with you, but the city is patient. The city is going to let you rest. The city has been doing that too for 400 years.